Hello and welcome back. So we're continuing to talk about philosophy of mind, and today's lecture is on Fred Dretske's recipe for thought. So Dretske is trying to offer a naturalized account of mental content. That is, our minds seem to be sort of special. We have meanings, right? And in the natural world, there's rocks, there's trees, but you might say they don't really mean anything, right? But I can have a thought in my head and it has a meaning. It represents the world. And so Dretske wants to come up with a way that natural processes, causal processes, could create something like meaning. So he begins by talking. He started out as an engineer actually before he became a philosophy professor. And he says, as an engineer, there was a general principle that we would kind of abide by, which was if you can't make one, you don't really know how it works. Right? To really under, to say you really understand how something works, you'd have to be able to build it from scratch. Right? So here we want to understand intelligence. We want to know how thought works. Right? Um, Says, well, you would need a recipe uh, for building it out of parts of things that you already understand. And important in this recipe, right, is that the parts can't already contain the thing you're trying to build, right? So again, if you want to understand or know how cakes work, you'd want to be able to build a cake. And so your recipe for building a cake shouldn't include smaller cakes, right, that you put together. You haven't really cracked the code of like what cakeness is if you're trying to build cake with cake, right? So if you're trying to build uh, intelligence, right, thought, mental states, you need to completely leave out any mental terms. You can't smuggle in the mental by just using a synonym, right? So things like attitude, interpretation, all of that has to be left out, and you have to try to uh, build thought or figure out the recipe for thought using completely non-mental terms to produce mental states, right? Um, and in the end, it won't matter so much if I myself could create a being with thought, right? So long as the recipe in principle could. So, you know, I can't build a cousin, but my aunt and uncle can build a cousin. I'm just not the sort of thing that can create a cousin, right? It has to be your relatives that do that. Um, so we can work out a recipe for thought, and maybe at this moment, for us, maybe we can't be the ones to actually build it. Uh, but as long as the recipe could be built by someone, we could say we understand thought and we have a recipe for thought. So, what are some of the key things about minds, right? That don't just beg the question and pack synonyms for mind into it, uh, that we could say are some basic components of a mental state. One thing is what we call intention with an S, right? So mental states are intentional with an S, and that is the opposite of an extensional with an S. So here's what we mean by intention and extension. So an intentional statement cannot be substituted sala verite, meaning preserving truth. So what that means is this, there's something special about mental states, right? We could say Nate believes that the murderer is a maniac, right? And that would be a true statement. But suppose the murderer happens to be the mayor, and I didn't know that. In that case, Nate believes that the mayor is a maniac would be false, even though the murderer and the mayor are the same person, right? So most of the time, right, in an extensional sort of statement, right, if we said uh, the murderer was convicted, right, and we said the mayor was convicted, right, we could swap those out and those would both be true if the mayor is the murderer, right? With most statements that are extensional, a term, right, sometimes we have two terms that refer to the same thing, right? The murderer, the mayor, Superman, Clark Kent, right? And so, I could say um, Superman saved everyone. I could say Clark Kent saved everyone. Those would both be true. I could swap those names out whenever I want to. But in certain contexts, namely mental state contexts about what someone believes, you can't always swap out those terms, even though they pick out the same thing. right? So that's something special about mental states, something special about beliefs, right? They're intentional with an S. You can't just swap out coextensional terms, coextensional meaning, two words that pick out the same thing. You, when it comes to beliefs, you can't always swap them out and keep the same truth value of the statement. Again, Nate believes that the murderer is a maniac, could be true. Nate believes that the mayor is a maniac, could be false, even if the mayor is the murderer, simply because I don't know that the mayor is the murderer, right? So that's the thing about intentional with an S context. They have this sort of special feature, and it seems like mental states have that special feature, right? So that's something we would want to account for in our recipe for thought. But intentionality with an S is not going to be enough, right? If we can create intentionality, it doesn't necessarily mean that we have a mental state yet. So, for example, a compass, right? So those little, pointers that point out north all the time because they have a magnet. Um, Compasses, arguably, have intentionality with an S as well. So a compass is going to pick out the North Pole, right? You hold up a compass, and wherever you are, it's going to point to the North Pole. And the compass is also going to pick out polar bears because polar bears happen to be at the North Pole. They are coextensive with the North Pole, except for like the ones at the zoo, right? Um, but the compass is actually uh, more sensitive than that. If you get far enough north, you can walk around near a polar bear. If you're at the North Pole, happen to be facing south, you might be facing a polar bear, and the compass isn't going to point at it, right? It's going to point north, right? So depending on what aspect you understand the compass under, it's going to track or indicate either polar bears or the North Pole, right? So this is kind of similar to the sort of intentionality you see in the mayor murderer case. And it's going to be a property of any state that contains information. Depending on how you describe the information it contains, uh, it might be true, right? Statements about it might be true or false. They might have this intentional aspect that you can't just substitute terms um, and preserve the truth value, right? So that's one special thing about mental states, right? They are intentional with an S, but it's also true of things like compasses. Anything that carries information is going to have that property. So it's not going to be enough just yet to be a recipe for thought to just have intentionality, but it might be a start. It might be a necessary condition. So mental states are informational states, but so are states of a compass, right? So is smoke, right? It contains information that there's fire. Tree rings carry information about the age of a tree. Um, but mental states are more than informational, they are representational, right? They are about things in a sense that's stronger than just carrying information. So the rings of a tree tell us the age, but you wouldn't say that the rings of the tree are about the age of the tree. They just happen to have a causal relationship with the age of the tree. So when something represents, so what's the difference between representing and just carrying information? Well, the key difference is something that represents can also misrepresent, right? So if uh, there happens to be something that caused the number of rings in the tree to not actually match the age of the tree, we wouldn't say that the tree is misrepresenting. It's just that, there's it's not matching, right? It's not accurately carrying information, but we wouldn't say that the tree rings would misrepresent. Or if you see smoke but there isn't fire, you wouldn't say that the smoke is misrepresenting the presence of fire. Um, you need something else. Mental states are the things that misrepresent, right? So if I say um, the sky is purple and it's not purple, I have misrepresented the sky. So what's the difference? What makes my statement the kind of thing that can get it wrong, right? That can misrepresent, whereas tree rings and smoke, um, they carry information, but we wouldn't say that they could misrepresent, right? Um, so what is misrepresentation? We need to get a recipe for thought. What we need is a recipe for misrepresentation, right? If we can build something that can get it wrong, that can represent something as being something, can represent the sky as being purple when it's actually blue, um, then we're on our way to a recipe for thought. So intentionality, one, right, with an S, one necessary component, but also the ability to misrepresent, which tells us that this thing actually is representing instead of just carrying information. That's another component we need for thought. Okay, so what's the difference between something that just carries information and something that something actually represents? In order to represent, you need to not only carry information about something, but you have to have that be your function, right? So a thermometer can misrepresent because it's been given its function by people. When I build a thermometer, right, and I put the markings for the temperatures on it, I mean for it, it's intended, it has the function of telling me the temperature. And so if I made the markings wrong and it's telling the temperature inaccurately, now it's misrepresenting the temperature. But that's not a natural representation, right? Because it got its representational function from me, a human, right? From my mind. So what we'd like to figure out is could a representational function arise naturally, right? Not just as a result of minds, but something prior to minds that minds could be built out of, right? Um, So humans can give things functions, and so we can make all sorts of things represent. I can make a sentence represent, state of the world. I can write down the sky is purple, and that sentence will represent, it'll actually misrepresent the color of the sky. I could write down the sky is blue, and that would accurately represent the color of the sky. Again, I could build a thermometer, and if I build it right, it will accurately represent the temperature. If I build it wrong, it will misrepresent the temperature. But these are all uh, already mental states. So is there some kind of function in nature that doesn't depend on human minds? So there's two ways we could understand function. So one way that function might arise is through natural selection, right? So we do sometimes think of, my heart has a function, right? Its job is to pump blood, right? Um, Back to polar bears, right? Polar bears have white fur, right? What's the function of that white fur? Well, it's to blend in, right, to the surrounding environment and make them more effective predators, right? Um, so, and no human gave them that function. It's not that a human mind decided, you might say that God decided, right? Um, but leaving that out for the moment, because our job right here is to try to make this just happen purely naturally without having a mind create the function. Um, you might argue, if Darwin's story is correct, that yeah, in some way, uh, nature has given the polar bear's white fur the function of camouflage, right? So your evolutionary history can create a function, right? And arguably that's, for example, one function of our minds is our sensory states, right? So um, my visual states represent the world, right? I have a visual sensation of a blue sky, and it's representing the sky as blue, and my eyes have evolved that way, right? To get information from the world and then represent it accurately, right? Um, if I have evolved a sort of a sensor for ripe fruit because it helps me to eat and survive, right? Then I have a ripe fruit detector, right? Um, and that's evolved naturally, and arguably it has the function of representing ripe fruit, and so uh, it rep it's possible to get it wrong, right? If my ripe fruit detector goes off around an unripe fruit, then I've misrepresented, which is evidence that I'm dealing with genuine representations here. So this is a interesting idea, right? Maybe this is the answer to how minds evolve, right? Or maybe this is our recipe for thought, right? Nature evolves uh, certain sensors, right? So, again, there's information out there all the time. Tree rings carry information about the age of the tree and so on. But maybe at some point in your brain, you evolve something that happens to have a causal relationship, an informational relationship with, say, ripe fruit, right? It goes off when you're around ripe fruit. You know, um, if that evolved for that purpose, right, then you have a mental state, right? You have a representation of ripe fruit, and if it goes off not around ripe fruit, then it's misrepresented, right? So that's the idea. So this is promising, right? But there are problems with it. Um, so Jerry Fodor famously has an objection to this naturalistic idea that representations, you know, arise because, um, again, we have these detectors in our brain of various environmental qualities uh, that have evolved for that purpose. And he says, well, look, evolution can't be the source of function. It's not giving us the right kind of function that we need for mental representations, right? So imagine you've got a frog's visual system that has evolved to pick out black dots, right? Um, in the frog's natural environment, black dots are typically, flies or mosquitoes or edible insects, right? So this frog's brain, it has a black dot detector, and when it detects a black dot, it sticks out its tongue, and it tends to uh, typically be an insect, and so that's good for the frog, right? And it could misrepresent occasionally, and in that case, um, frog will not get an insect. Well, the problem that Fodor points out is that this visual system is also going to pick out, BBs. If you've ever had a BB gun with the little black, metal balls, right? The frog's black dot detector would fire for those too, and those aren't flies, right? But the problem is that really a misrepresentation, right? So if the visual system, again, is just picking out black dots in the visual field, it's doing its job, actually, right? So it's actually a fly or BB detector, right? Um, and in that case, um, that's not giving us the function we want. It's not giving us the potential for misrepresentation. Every time it fires, right, around a black dot, it's just doing its job. But we would like to say that if the frog tries to eat a BB, it's gotten it wrong, right? That it's misrepresenting, right? That it's supposed to be picking out flies. So again, Fodor's point is evolution isn't really that picky, right? It'll evolve detectors that just fire, and if they fire around the black dots, then they're doing it right. They're not really misrepresenting, so they're not giving us what we want for uh, real thought. In general, any, detector that's evolved to pick out Fs, F being anything, right? Black dots or horses or, ripe fruit. Um, well, if Fs and Gs happen to go together, then it's evolved to pick out Gs just as much as Fs, right? Uh, Evolution is extensional, not intentional, right? It's a purely causal system, and it doesn't view objects under an interpretation, like the murderer and the mayor, right? So again, uh, evolution can't decide between those two things. Evolution, Fodor argues, isn't intentional with an S, right? Um, so this is a version, this is called the disjunction problem for these naturalistic accounts of mental content, right? And it sort of plagues all of these accounts. So, um, if if I've got Fodor's joke, which I don't know if it'll come through in this video, but I'll try it, right? So Fodor says, suppose I've got a horse detector in my brain, right? Um, well, he says anything that makes that fire, um, right, should count, right, as part of its function. And he says it's not going to fire just around horses, right? It'll fire around the merest ripple in horse-infested waters, right? He says so. If I'm thinking about horses and I'm worried about horses and I'm worried there's going to be horses next to me in the water, yeah, just a little ripple will make my horse detector go off. And he says that's not a misrepresentation. That's just your horse detector firing when it fires, right? That's all evolution can really give you. So he's saying evolution can't give you misrepresentation, right? So Dretske concedes this objection, and he says, okay, we need something extra to get a naturalistic account of mental content, right? And so it's not just evolution, right? It's not just this function that evolves through evolution, but also there has to be during the lifetime of the organism, not just through its evolutionary history, but during the lifetime of mere you, um, it also has to develop a function during my lifetime to detect these things. And he says if you add that together with the evolutionary function, then you can get around this disjunction problem. Uh, the literature goes on, right? This argument goes on, but that's Dretske's response. So he says, look, mental states, um, for them to really represent, have to be the states of a system that's capable of learning during its lifetime, right? It must be able to modify its own structure and not just wait for evolution to do it. Right? So he says nothing can become the thought that F without contributing to a rational response to an F, a response that is appropriate given the system's needs and or desires. So if we have a system that's evolved, right, to pick out, black dots, but then that system can also learn to distinguish between flies and BBs. Now, Dretske says, now we have something that represents, and this is truly a mental state. Now we have an evolution for thought. So, if you find this interesting, there's lots of other literature I could point you to. I just wanted to give you a flavor of some of the mainstream philosophy of mind, naturalistic accounts of the mind in through the 80s and the 90s and in the early 2000s. Uh, there's something that has to, in a sense, has to be right about it, right? So minds have to be natural systems that evolved somehow. Um, and the key thing about minds that makes them special is they represent the world, right? The rest of the world just is what it is, but minds have a sort of perspective on the world, right? And they say something about the world. They represent, and how could that happen naturally? And so the answer has to be something like this. Information carrying systems evolve to have a certain function, to pick out certain states of the world. Uh, but getting into the details, there's a lot of problems with really getting it fully worked out. But I wanted to give you a taste of that uh, vein of scholarship. All right, well, I will catch you next time.